Welcome to Miss Scarlett. Subscribe and don't miss out on Patreon. Have fun! I woke up to the sound of my husband, Dan, bustling around in the kitchen. The sun had yet to rise, and the room was still dark, but I could make out the outline of my husband's broad shoulders as he moved about the room. "Coffee?" he called out, knowing full well that I couldn't start my day without my morning caffeine fix. "Yes, please," I groaned, rolling over and reaching for my phone on the nightstand. As I scrolled through my emails, I heard the familiar whir of the espresso machine and the clang of Dan's favorite mug being placed on the counter. I dragged myself out of bed and wrapped my robe tightly around me as I made my way downstairs. The crisp morning air sent a shiver down my spine, and I quickened my pace. Dan was already at the kitchen counter, sipping his coffee and reading the newspaper. He was dressed in his usual weekend attire, sweatpants and a t-shirt. His dark hair was messy, and he hadn't shaved in a few days, giving him a ruggedly handsome appearance. "Good morning," I mumbled, pouring myself a cup of coffee and adding a splash of cream. "Morning," he replied, lowering his newspaper and giving me a quick kiss on the cheek. "Big plans for today?" "Not really," I said with a shrug. "Maybe some shopping, lunch with the girls. You?" "Oh, you know, the usual. Going to mow the lawn, watch the game." "Wait, hold up," I interrupted, raising an eyebrow. "You're telling me that you're going to spend your Saturday doing guy stuff while I go and do all the stereotypical girl things?" Dan froze, mid-sip, and a sheepish grin spread across his face. "Well, when you put it like that, it does sound kinda sexist." "Kinda?" I laughed. "Come on, Dan. We're supposed to be a modern, progressive couple. We can't just fall back on these outdated gender norms." Dan sighed. "You're right. I'm sorry. It's just, I don't know. Sometimes it's easy to fall back on old habits." I took a sip of my coffee, considering his words. True. But what if we didn't have that option? What if we had to experience a day in each other's shoes? "You mean, like, literally switch genders for a day?" Dan's eyes widened at the thought. "Why not?" I challenged, feeling a rush of excitement at the idea. "It could be a fun experiment. We could see firsthand what it's like to navigate the world as the opposite gender." Dan set down his mug and rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "It's definitely an interesting concept. But how would it work? I can't just magically become a woman for a day." "No, but we could try to emulate the experience as closely as possible," I suggested. "We could dress the part, adopt new mannerisms, and try to conform to the gender norms associated with our new identities."
"I suppose we could give it a shot,"
Dan said, a note of hesitation in his voice.
"But where do we even start?"
"With a fresh canvas, of course," I said, already formulating a plan in my mind. "We'll need to remove all traces of our current identities and start from scratch." And so, our gender-bending adventure began. The first step was to transform our physical appearances. I led Dan upstairs to our bedroom and pulled out a suitcase from the back of our closet. Opening it, I revealed a collection of wigs, makeup, and clothing that I had secretly assembled over the past week, knowing that this day might come.
"Wow, you were prepared for this," Dan remarked, running a hand through his wig. "Is this why you kept asking me about my wardrobe preferences?"
"Maybe," I said with a playful smile. "Now, sit down and let's get started. We've got a lot to do." I guided Dan to the edge of the bed and handed him a silky purple robe. "Here, put this on." He raised an eyebrow, but did as he was told, slipping out of his sweatpants and t-shirt and donning the luxurious robe. The fabric accentuated his broad shoulders and muscular frame, creating an interesting contrast. "Okay, now for the fun part," I said, reaching for the makeup bag. I laid out the various products on the bed: foundation, concealer, eyeshadow palettes, lipsticks, and more. We're going to start with a fresh base. I applied a layer of foundation to Dan's face, blending it carefully to match his skin tone. Concealer was used to hide any imperfections, and a light dusting of powder set the base. Dan watched me work with a mixture of fascination and amusement. "This is taking longer than I thought it would," he commented as I began contouring his cheeks. "Beauty takes time, my dear," I replied with a wink. "And we want the full experience, don't we?" Dan sighed dramatically, but nodded in agreement. As I worked, I explained each step of the process to Dan, from the primer to the setting spray, letting him know that this was just the tip of the iceberg when it came to makeup routines. His eyes widened as I described the countless tutorials and videos dedicated to perfecting the art of makeup application. "And women do this every day?" he asked, his voice laced with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Many do," I confirmed. "It's a way to express ourselves, enhance our features, and feel more confident." Dan ran a hand over his smooth cheeks, now expertly contoured and highlighted. "I feel like a different person already." "Just you wait," I said, reaching for a pair of false eyelashes. "We're only getting started." The transformation was incredible. Dan sat patiently as I applied a dramatic smoky eye, complete with winged eyeliner and voluminous lashes. His lips were painted a bold shade of crimson, and his eyebrows were shaped and defined. The final touch was a long, wavy wig cascading over his shoulders in rich brown locks. "Now," I said, stepping back to admire my handiwork, "time for the big reveal." Dan stood up and made his way over to the full-length mirror, his eyes widening at his reflection. "Wow," he breathed. "Is that really me?" I smiled, pleased with the result. "It certainly is. What do you think?" Dan turned this way and that, taking in his new appearance from every angle. "I feel so different. It's like I've stepped into someone else's body." "That's the point," I said, handing him a small handbag. "Now, let's work on your walk and your posture. Women carry themselves differently. You need to relax your shoulders and tilt your hips forward slightly when you walk." Dan practiced walking back and forth across the room, his movements exaggerated at first, before gradually becoming more fluid and natural. "That's it," I encouraged. "You're getting the hang of it." As Dan mastered the art of walking in heels, I began my own transformation. It was a challenge to apply makeup and style my hair without any help, but I managed to create a look that was softer and more feminine than my usual style. I chose a form-fitting dress that accentuated my curves and slipped into a pair of heels. When I emerged from the bedroom, Dan's eyes lit up. "Wow, you look—" "I know," I said, striking a pose. "Let's not forget that we're both adapting to new bodies and new styles today." "Touché," Dan said with a grin. "Shall we head out and see how the world treats us?" Our first stop was the local mall. As we strolled through the corridors, I couldn't help but notice the stares we attracted. Some people did double takes, their eyes widening at the sight of Dan's striking appearance. I felt a rush of pride as I linked my arm through his, my heart swelling with love and admiration for his willingness to take on this challenge. We decided to split up for a while, agreeing to meet back at a central spot in an hour. Dan set off to explore the women's clothing section, while I headed to the men's department. As I browsed the racks, I felt a sense of freedom and anonymity that I hadn't experienced in a long time. No one gave me a second glance. I was just another guy browsing for a new shirt or pair of jeans. It was refreshing, but also a little unnerving. I was so used to standing out as a woman, to being noticed and evaluated based on my appearance. Now I was practically invisible. I selected a few items and made my way to the fitting room, where I tried on a variety of outfits. I had to admit, it was nice not to worry about sucking in my stomach or finding the most flattering angle. I simply pulled on the clothes and assessed them based on comfort and style. Meanwhile, Dan was having a very different experience. He found himself drawn to the brightly colored displays of the lingerie section, where he marveled at the delicate fabrics and intricate designs. He selected a few pieces, his heart racing as he imagined himself wearing them. However, as he made his way to the fitting room, he noticed the stares and whispers that followed him. Some women smiled at him, while others scowled, their eyes narrowing in judgment. He felt exposed and vulnerable, as if he were an intruder in a space that wasn't meant for him. Back in the men's department, I was having a similar realization. As I tried on a casual button-down shirt, I noticed the other guys in the fitting room giving me subtle once-overs, sizing me up. I felt their eyes on me, evaluating my body, my muscles, my overall masculinity. It was unnerving, and I felt a sudden urgency to bulk up, to prove my worth as a man. As we each navigated our new identities, the challenges and pressures associated with gender norms became increasingly apparent. Dan discovered the difficulty of choosing an outfit that was both stylish and comfortable, only to realize that the dressing room line for women was significantly longer than the one for men. He waited impatiently, his arms laden with dresses and blouses, while I strolled into the men's fitting room and immediately found an available stall. When we finally met up again, we compared notes on our experiences.
I had no idea it was so complicated to be a woman, Dan said, shaking his head. The expectations are just so high. And don't even get me started on the whole makeup and fashion thing. It's like there's this unwritten rule book that everyone's supposed to follow.
I nodded in agreement.
It's true. And it's not just fashion. There are unspoken rules about how we're supposed to act and behave, too. Yeah, I noticed that, Dan said, rolling his eyes. I kept getting dirty looks from people whenever I voiced my opinion a little too strongly, or if I laughed too loudly. It's like I suddenly had to be demure and soft-spoken all the time.
Well, that's not entirely true, I said with a smile. But yes, there is a certain expectation for women to be more gentle and nurturing. It's like we're always walking a tightrope between being assertive and being perceived as snarky.
That's crazy, Dan said, shaking his head.
No wonder women are always talking about smashing the patriarchy. I laughed. It's definitely given me a new perspective. I feel like I've been navigating a minefield all day, trying to balance being friendly without seeming flirty, or assertive without being aggressive. And don't even get me started on catcalling, Dan added, his face darkening.
I can't believe how often it happens. I've only been presenting as a woman for a few hours, and I've already lost count of the number of times.
I sighed, thinking back to the unwanted attention I'd received over the years. Sadly, it's something we just learn to deal with. Ignore it, pretend it doesn't bother you, or come up with a clever retort. It's exhausting. We decided to take a break from shopping and sat down at a cafe, sipping lattes and people-watching. As we observed the interactions around us, we began to notice the subtle and not-so-subtle ways that gender norms influenced behavior. Look at that couple over there, Dan said, nodding discreetly toward a nearby table. See how the woman is constantly touching the man's arm and laughing at his jokes? It's like she's seeking his validation or something. I followed his gaze and noticed the dynamic he was describing. It is interesting. I wonder if she's doing it consciously, or if it's just an instinctual thing.
Who knows? Dan said with a shrug. But it's definitely something I've never paid attention to before. It's like a whole new layer of human interaction has been revealed to me.
That's exactly how I feel, I said, leaning forward in my seat. Take a look at those two guys sitting at the bar. See how they're both trying to one-up each other with stories about their latest business deals or whatever? It's like they're in constant competition. Dan observed the men, nodding in understanding.
Right, and the way they're drinking their whiskey straight and acting all macho. It's almost like they're performing for each other. Exactly, I said, feeling a sense of camaraderie with my husband as we bonded over these new insights.
It's like we've unlocked a secret code or something. As the day progressed, we continued to navigate our new identities, sometimes stumbling but always learning. Dan discovered the frustration of trying to ask for directions without being mansplained to, while I experienced the joy of being listened to and respected during a conversation about sports. We noticed the differences in how people treated us, from the servers who automatically assumed Dan wanted a salad to the salesman who directed all his answers to me, despite Dan being the one asking the questions. As the sun began to set, we headed home, both of us exhausted from the emotional and physical toll of the day. We kicked off our shoes and collapsed onto the couch, sharing a laugh as we propped our feet up on the coffee table.
So? I said, reaching for Dan's hand. What have we learned today? Dan squeezed my hand and sighed. That being a woman is hard work. I had no idea the amount of effort that goes into maintaining your appearance, dealing with societal expectations, and navigating a world that constantly judges and objectifies you. I know, I said, my voice filled with sympathy. And it's not just the external stuff. It's the constant mental juggling act of trying to be strong and independent, but also sensitive and nurturing. Always having to prove yourself, but also not stepping on any toes. Yeah, it's a lot, Dan agreed, and I have a whole new appreciation for what you go through on a daily basis. I smiled softly, squeezing his hand tighter. And what about being a man? What insights did you gain there? Dan paused, considering his words. Well, it's definitely not as easy as I thought it would be. There's this pressure to always be in control, to never show weakness. Men are expected to be strong, both physically and emotionally. Exactly, I said, my voice softening. And that pressure can be incredibly toxic. It leads to all sorts of issues, from unhealthy risk-taking to suppressing emotions. Dan nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. It really made me reflect on the way I've behaved in the past. I realized that I've often fallen back on stereotypical male behaviors without even realizing it. It's like I was on autopilot. We all do it, I said gently. It's ingrained in us from a young age, but the first step to breaking free from those norms is recognizing them and questioning them. True, Dan said, his voice softening. And I guess that's what today was all about, challenging those assumptions and gaining a deeper understanding of each other. Exactly, I said, leaning over to give him a kiss. Now, do you think you can handle applying some makeup remover and helping me with this wig? Dan laughed, reaching for the bottle of remover. Of course. And then maybe we can order some takeout. I feel like I've barely eaten today. Sounds perfect, I said, already making my way upstairs to the bathroom. Oh, and Dan? Yeah? Thank you for doing this with me. It means a lot. Anytime, he said, his voice carrying a hint of affection. It's been quite the eye-opener. And with that, we began the process of returning to our usual selves, knowing that we would never see the world, or each other, in quite the same way again.
Thanks for watching, my girlies! Be sure to check out Patreon for more!